Hi everybody, it's Mallory Smythe with Endow. Why did St. John Paul II write Letter to Women in the first place? As we read church documents, as we study scripture, often knowing the foundations of where these things came from can bring new light and new understanding to what we're reading. So Pope John Paul II actually wrote Letter to Women in between two United Nations conferences. The first one was in Cairo in 1994, where the Pope actually went on a campaign to prevent abortion from being enshrined in the UN documents as a human right. And so the abortion advocates were out trying to get this as a worldwide human right, and John Paul II did everything he could to stop it, and he was successful. He actually stopped abortion from being enshrined as a human right in the UN documents. But he knew that a year later at the Women's Conference in Beijing that the same issue would come up and the same people would be pushing even harder to get these things enshrined as part of the United Nations. And so what he did was he circumvented all media. He knew how the media could misconstrue his words and the teachings of the church, and he just decided to go straight to women. And so that's actually what he wrote in the very beginning of Letter to Women. He says, "I am writing this letter to each of you as a sign of solidarity and gratitude on the eve of the 4th World Conference on Women to be held in Beijing this coming September." He skips down and he says, "I would like now to speak directly to every woman, to reflect with her on the problems and the prospects of what it means to be a woman in our time." Now, I know that the church has a reputation for being anti-woman or antiquated or all these things. But how special is it that one of the successors of Peter sat down to pen a letter directly to every single woman in the world, saying, yes, culture has something to say to you, but so do we. God has something to say to you. The church has something to say to you, and so I'm writing directly to you. I'm not going through anybody else. And I want to reflect on the problems that you have uniquely experienced. But I also want to talk about your dignity, and I want to talk about what God and the church has to say about you. Like, how beautiful that he and audacious that he did that, and that we can hold this letter in our hands today. The one other thing that struck me so deeply as I was reading through the beginning of the study was whenever our writer quoted George Weigel. George Weigel is John Paul II's biographer, and he was talking about the Cairo conference. And he says, the most consequential thing that the planners of the Cairo conference had failed to take into account was the moral power of John Paul II. The moral power. What is the power of moral authority? This quote actually made me think of another story that Curtis Martin shared at one of the Focus conferences, when he was talking about how Mother Teresa was at this meeting with lawmakers in California, and she passes the governor of California, who she had met before, who was raised Catholic and who was advocating for abortion. And she shakes his hand, she keeps going, and turns around and basically just tells him that his stance on abortion is wrong and he needs to change it. No apologies, no sweetness, just matter of fact, and keeps on going. That's the power of moral authority. That is the power of truth lived out in a person, right? We can see advocates for things in our world that are wrong and that are detrimental to human dignity, but just one person who's living out love of God and teachings of his church boldly and with joy and with truth and just living it every day can actually create huge change, because moral authority has power. And so as we're coming into the fall, if you haven't read Letter to Women, as a woman, John Paul II wrote it to you. And I encourage you to read it and to see the power of his moral authority lived out and the power that your moral authority can have in our world. Thanks, and have a great week.